Hello everyone, myself Ankita Tripathi, working as an associate professor in IIMT College of Pharmacy. Today we are going to discuss about cell injury, what is basic principle, what is the adaptation principle, and what exactly a cell adaptation is. Before proceeding to the exact topic, let's have a quick overview what basically a cell injury means. See, cell, as we all know, that's the basic function of our life. Any kind of stress or stimuli which changes the function and the structure of a cell is known as cell injury. Or by the definition, its cell injury is defined as effect of variety of the stress stimuli. It can be due to lack of oxygen, it can be mechanical trauma, it can be accident, it can be acid base, etc., which a cell encounter, which result in the changes in internal and external environment, is known as cell injury. Basically, cell injury varies or depends upon two variables. One, the host cell, on which a kind of cell on which the stress is going to occur. Second, factors. Factors means it can be either due to lack of oxygen, due to lack of blood, mechanical factor, or the extent, like at what severity the cell injuries has been done. These are the two factors on which a cell injury depends. Cell injury is basically of two types, reversible and irreversible cell injury. Reversible cell injury by means that when a cell has encountered any kind of cell, an injury has formed. Meanwhile, it will remove the stress, the cell will regain or restore its originality in the form of structure and function. This is known as reversible cell injury. Irreversible cell injury, when the stimulus is very severe, and it results ultimately result in a cell death, is known as irreversible cell injury. Basically, cell injury, or for example, see, this is a normal cell. We have any kind of stress is formed, it leads to the bulb formation, that is a swelling. Ultimately, what happened, as the stress regrades, our cell is recounted the back. And in this irreversible cell injury, once the stimulus or the cause or the stress is very severe, it cannot be replaced. This is how cell injury, reversible and irreversible, differs. Coming to the causes of cell injury, generally causes is being classified in two forms. One is genetic cause, which we get by birth, and one is acquired, which we get after birth. That is cell injury causes. See, if we go on the normal process or on the normal diagram, here is a normal cell. When it encountered a stress, it either can adapt it, means it can adopt the changes and retain their life in the same way. Other, if it is can't retain, it causes cell injury. Cell injury basically is two types. Reversible, once the stress is moderate or less severe, it can regain its own structure and function. But once the stress is severe or causes that, it can either cause necrosis cell death or apoptosis cell. Necrosis is non-programmed cell death. Apoptosis is programmed cell death. Coming to genetic causes generally means the changes in our genes, abnormalities in our chromosome. These are the genetic causes. For example, we have a disease known as sickle cell anemia, Down syndrome. These kind of disease have chromosomal defects and which cannot be cured generally. Coming to acquired causes, we have first hypoxia. Hypoxia generally means lack of oxygen. What happens when any kind of cell injury is there, our blood flow decreases. The blood, as we know, the blood is a carrier of an oxygen, which leads to the leading oxygen level, and hypoxia occur. Due to decrease in our oxygen level, our mitochondria, the process known as aerobic respiration, decreases. So somehow the ATP production is also decreases. The ATP production, when decreases, it inhibits sodium potassium ATPase pump, which leads to sodium and water move into the cell, which cause swelling, and potassium move out of the cell to maintain the equilibrium. But once the sodium and water enters the cell to the most extent, it causes osmotic pressure increment. Ultimately, what happens? Our body or all the cell generally swells. This leads to when the swelling gets severe, it also leads to degeneration or like a disruption of the cell membrane. This is how the hypoxia causes cell injury. As I've already discussed, when there is a decrease in the blood flow, oxygen level decreases. Oxygen level decreases generally cause respiratory or respiratory failure, cardiorespiratory failure, etc. Physical agent. Physical agent means when there is a high temperature which causes burn, or very cold temperature which causes freeze out, or the radiation like UV, ultra. All these physical factors or changes in any atmospheric pressure affects our cell or like may cause any changes structure and a function. This is known as physical agent. Chemical agent. Chemical generally means acid. Any kind of acid like hydrochloric acid, nitric acid, or cyanide poisoning, insecticide, pesticides, alcohol, which damages our cell is one of the example of chemical agent causing cell injury. Infection diseases, infection agent like any microorganism, bacteria, protozoa, fungi, viruses, which also causes disease to our body is known as infection agents causes cell injury. Immunological disorder, our allergic reaction, our hypersensitive reaction are the one of the main example of immunological disorder, which generally affects our immune system. Nutrition imbalance, for example, see, sodium is required for our action potential generation. Calcium is required for our muscle contraction. When there is disturbance, like when the amount is increased or decreased, then the essential required amount, it causes nutrition imbalance. See, if there's a decrease in nutrition like protein, marasmus kind of disease occur. And if it is decrease in RBC, anemia occurs. If it is decrease in minerals like iron, cobalt, the iron, anemia occurs. Psychological factors. Psychological factor means when our brain like function. If I couldn't get this, I'll not work. The best example is smoking, alcoholism, and drug addiction. What happens if we consume or we'll have alcohol inside the body? It affects our liver, which decreases our metabolism function. Ultimately, fatty cirrhosis, fatty liver, or cirrhosis of liver occurs. This is how the psychological factor like drug addiction and alcoholism and smoking causes cell injury. As it is irreversible form of cell injury is also known as cell death. Ultimately, it is of two types, necrosis and apoptosis. Necrosis is generally a cell non-programmed death. Means what happened? Once the stress is severe, it results in the bulb or swelling formation. Ultimately, what happened? It causes the swelling of the outer membrane of the cell and ultimately it ruptures. So what happened? The internal organelles comes out of the body and causing ultimate cell death. Apoptosis generally means programmed cell death. What happens once the stress is severe? It leads into the bulb formation, that is swelling. This swelling happens around the inside the cell and outside the cell. Means it causes swelling of both cell membrane as well as internal organelles. Ultimately, what happens when it's swelling severe or it gets progressive increases, the rupture occurs of both the cell organelles as well as cell membrane. This kind of death is known as programmed cell death or apoptosis, which leads to the formation of apoptotic bodies. This diagram is generally so. See, the normal cell, if say, for example, this is normal cell, if any kind of stresses occur and it recovers back, this is known as reversible cell injury. Once what happens, if the stress progresses, it causes bulb formation of the outer surface and leading to the rupture of outer membrane is known as necrosis. When this or in some other way, if the stress gets severe and it called bulb formation of the outer surface as well as in the inner organelles and ultimately causes rupture of both cell organelles as well as cell membrane, it is known as apoptotic bodies and the process is known as apoptosis. This is how the cell or death occurs. For example, normal cell, which causes cell injury, which have a stress, which causes cell injury. It causes a swelling of cell, that is a bulb formation, and ultimately when it leads to the cell death, it's necrosis or apoptosis occur. And when the cell injury gets recovered, it's known as reversible cell injury. What is pathogenesis? Pathogenesis is derived from the two words. Patho means disease and genesis means mechanism. It ultimately means the process or the study of a mechanism of how the disease occur in the body is known as pathogenesis. Generally, when we talk about pathogenesis, we generally talk about how a pathogen has entered our body, what changes they have made in the body, and ultimately a cell injury or a cell death has been caused. First is a damage of plasma membrane. How does a damage of plasma membrane occur? For example, see, when there is any kind of stress occur to our cell, it causes ischemia, which is decrease in a cell, or which is decrease in a blood flow. When there's a decrease in a blood flow, our oxygen level decreases. Once the oxygen level decreases, it causes hypoxia. Ultimately, when there is a decrease in oxygen, our aerobic respiration does not take place. Ultimately, ATP won't form. If ATP is not formed, ATP associated sodium potassium ATPs pump will not work. What happens if this pump does not work? Our sodium and water influx increases inside the cell, and potassium efflux increases outside the cell. Ultimately, what happens? It causes the swelling of a cell membrane. Ultimately, when the swelling increases, it leads to the rupture of a plasma membrane or the depletion of plasma membrane. This is what we have taught in the first point, that is damage to the plasma membrane. Ultimately, the plasma membrane get ruptured and all the organelles inside the cell or inside the plasma membrane oozes out. This is how the ultimately cell causes its death. The same diagram has shown it. Second is mitochondrial damage. Mitochondrial damage, generally what happens when there is a decrease in the ATP formation, it also causes the influx of calcium ions. Influx of calcium ions will cause some excessive muscle contraction. The muscle contraction will causes the damage to the mitochondrial membrane, and it causes stiffness. So ultimately, when mitochondria will not work, entire cell will not work, because mitochondria is also known as the powerhouse of the cell. So there would be neither the formation of ATP, neither the formation of energy to process the cell to work. Ribosomal damage. How ribosomal damage okay? When there is a decrease in ATP formation, when there is a decrease in ATP formation, or when there is a swelling, so what happens that ribosomes attached to ER get it detached. The detachment of ribosomes to its ER leads to non-formation of a protein, which ultimately causes nuclear damage, because no protein is formed. Nothing can be goes to what the function is going to be performed by the cell. So ultimately, nuclear get damaged. This is a summary how a cell injury occurs. Just let me brief it out. When there is a decrease in an ATP, because there's a decrease in an oxygen and aerobic process was not done. So ultimately what happens? Swelling occurs. Swelling occurs causes the mitochondrial damage. Even a decrease in a sodium also increases the influx of sodium, water, and calcium ion, which ultimately causes a muscle contraction, because calcium ion is increased in the cell. This muscle contraction increases microbial permeability. This microbial permeability leads to the leakage of proteins or pro-apoptotic bodies. Somehow, the increase of reactive oxygen species also leads to the damage of lipids, protein, and air, because causing its lipolysis. Membrane damage occurs by two ways: either by the excessive swelling due to the influx of sodium, water, and calcium, and other by the lysosomal membrane leakage. What happens? It activates the digestional enzymes, and which kills the internal organs of the body. Second is last is a protein or a misfolding or DNA damage. What happens if ER get detached from the ribosome, or if the ribosome get detached from ER, so no proteins will be formed. So nothing can be coded to how the cell is going to work. So no function will be performed. Ultimately, the cell or the nucleus will get damaged. That is a nuclear damage. Now, the morphology of a cell injury or cellular adaptation. Morphology means how we look to the cell, means the outer appearance of the cell. Outer appearance of the cell generally means size or the number, and basically the colors as well. But we are in this topic, we are going to study about the size and the number of the cell. Generally, hypertrophy, generally the morphology of cell injury or cellular adaptation is how the change in the number or how the change in the structure occurs. Either it can increase the number of a cell, or either it can swell this, or it can increase the size, or in the same how it can decrease the number of the cell, or it can decrease the size of the cell. This is how the morphology of a cell injury or cellular adaptation means. First set, hypertrophy. Trophy is a word which means size. When there is an increase in the size of a cell is known as hypertrophy. For example, swelling. Cell swelling is a best example. Second, hormone increment of a increase or release of a growth hormone, also called increase in the height, that is gigantism, obesity. All these are when there's an increase in the size due to any of the reasons is known as hypertrophy. That is atrophy. When there's a decrease in a height is known as atrophy. For example, dwarfism, like hyperthyroidism. All these are the example. When there's a decrease in a hormone, when there is a decrease in upon hormonal disbalance, all this leads to the decrease in a size. This is known as atrophy. Second is hyperplasia. Plasia means like a enlargement of a tissue, that is like size. Hyperplasia means when there is an enlargement or a number of, for example, when there's an increase in the number of the cell, is known as hyperplasia. Metaplasia, when the structure change with the same similar structure, is known as metaplasia. For example, chain smoker. Chain smoker have epithelium tissues over the legs, which is changed to squamous epithelium. This is known as metaplasia. Autophagy, when ultimately autophagy means, or dysplasia means, when there is when once is a epithelium, it changed with the connective tissue. All the thing, a change of a structure of A to B is known as autophagy. This diagram is so when there is a decrease in a size is known as atrophy. When there's an increase in a size is known as hypertrophy. When there is an increase in a number of a cell is known as hyperplasia. When there's a decrease in a number of cells is known as aplasia. When there's a change in structure within the cell is known as metaplasia. When there's a change in the number as well as the size is known as hyperplasia and hypertrophy. Now coming to the topic homeostasis. Homeo means same, status means stable. A condition or a process of body in which we maintain equilibrium within internal and external environment is known as homeostasis. Homeostasis generally what it means? It created a balance between internal environment and external environment. Is there any change in internal and external environment of a body or a cell, homeostasis works. Homeostasis has its 5 components. One is a receptor, which receives the changes. Second, or I can say first is the stress to which is occur. Second is the receptor on which the changes occurs. Effector is a control center or brain which will perceive that there is a change in the receptor organ. Fourth, that is effector. It is an organ which which get order from a brain to replicate or to make the changes to get normalize the receptor. Fifth is response. What effector organ has done or what is going to do for completing the concluding or by creating the changes to the normal state is known as response. Generally what happened, if homeostasis works with the 2 feedback mechanism. One is positive feedback mechanism and another is negative feedback mechanism. In positive feedback mechanism, we can store the function, but we cannot store the structure. We cannot restore the structure. This is called positive feedback mechanism. While in negative feedback mechanism, we can restore both structure and function. For example, body temperature, increase of insulin by beta cells. And for example, when there is an increase in temperature due to any of the reason, our skin perceives a heatness. This is received by the control center. What control center did? Control center commands sweat glands to release sweating, which will remove our extra heat or from the body in the form of sweat. This is how basically we have restored our surface or the structure and the function as well. This is how negative feedback mechanism work. But in positive feedback mechanism, we can only store our function, but structure cannot be restored again. So this is negative feedback mechanism. For example, for example, positive feedback mechanism, parturition, that is a birth baby. When and during the normal delivery, the size of cervix is small. Due to release of oxytocin, the muscle contraction occurs and the size of cervix increases because it has to pulls out the head of the baby. So once the baby has get delivered, mother at the second time can have its normal delivery, but the size of the cervix once increases cannot be regain its back size. So this is how the negative feedback mechanism work. This is the diagram. See, once a stimulus, any kind of stress occur, it has received by the receptor organ. The receptor organ sends the message to control center that I have got some changes in it. Control center perceive that changes and order effector organ to like secrete or do something that will restore its function and structure. Once the structure and the function is both is restored, it is known as negative feedback mechanism, for which I have given example of body temperature. See, when the body temperature exceeded from 37 degrees Celsius, it serves the sensors like nerve cells, like for example, heating on the skin has been centered, and the brain has given an order to sweat glands to release the sweat, which will control our like temperature. This is how negative feedback mechanism occurs. A positive feedback mechanism, what I have said, function can be restored back, but the structure cannot be restored. For example, it has the example of cervix or normal delivery. During a parturition, the size of the cervix is very slow. If we have to get, we have to pull the baby's head out of the cervix, we need to release, like our body release a hormone known as oxytocin. Oxytocin, what generally do, it contracts the muscle, and which will help the like baby to get the baby heads to get pulled out from the cervix. Once the baby is born, mother can have its second normal delivery, but the size of the cervix cannot be restored to its originality. This is how the positive feedback mechanism works. I hope this lecture has helped you more. For further query, you can just contact us.